Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I too join with those who thank you for bringing forward a budget. As we all know, it's very difficult to create a budget in the circumstances that we face right now in the United States with our fiscal policy, and I believe you've done a very good job. This is a budget that balances. It's a budget that has important reforms that will help to improve the processes by which Congress operates. It's a budget that contemplates addressing those concerns that have just been raised about our burgeoning health care costs. It's a budget that contemplates the kind of reform in our tax code that we need to make America more competitive and generate those jobs that we all agree are necessary to keep our economy strong. And I, again, commend you for that. Remarkably, we are still debating in Washington, D.C. whether we have a budget crisis. Although there's been lip service a lot to the question as to whether or not we have a crisis, the fact is that those who say, well, we've gotten past it, make the case that we've reduced our deficits by 66% in the last 5 or 6 years. What they don't point out is that we have increased our deficit in the 2 years prior to that by 800%. And our current deficits are still nearly $500 billion a year. That's a crisis. I think perhaps the biggest crisis our nation faces, and we have a lot of crises a lot of threats today, but I think perhaps the biggest threat we face is the one that comes from within, and that's our national debt. There's been a lot of discussion today about interest and what it's doing to our capacity to properly govern in the United States. I want to put a little more picture to that story. Interest, as it has been already said, is now at a little under $200 billion in our budget and will grow to about $800 billion over the projected 10-year budget window. But what does that mean? Well, interest is the fastest growing, if I understand the numbers right, the fastest growing part of our federal budget. And just to put a little comparison to it, in about 5, maybe 6 years max, the total interest that we will pay on our national debt will be greater than all defense spending. And at the same time, it will also have exceeded all non-defense spending. And the kind of charts that we are all too accustomed to seeing here will start happening with interest, where the differential grows and grows and grows in almost exponential proportions. It will push out our ability to do the kinds of things that we all agree we need to do. And yet we continue to argue over whether we have a crisis. We continue to argue over whether we need to show some austerity and we need to deal with this crisis by addressing the issues. The problem in our fiscal policy in America is that we spend more than we bring in revenue, not that our taxes are too low. The problem that we have is that we will not recognize that tough decisions have to be made. And this budget makes some tough decisions. And again, I commend you, Mr. Chairman, for that. I believe that if we would recognize that responsible restraint in our spending is critical as a major component of our reform, that we could achieve those kind of spending restraints without the kind of, frankly, unfortunate ways that the sequestration policy has forced upon us. This budget does not rely on sequestration. It meets the budget caps. It adopts, essentially, if I understand it, Mr. Chairman, the Budget Control Act caps. And as long as we meet those caps, we do not face the problematic impact of across-the-board cuts. It allows for a deficit-neutral reserve fund that will let this Congress, this committee as a part of it, work to figure out how we can then address some of those areas that need to be strengthened, such as our national defense spending and some of the other critical areas that we need to focus on. I agree with, I believe, all of my colleagues here in this committee, Republican and Democrat, that investment in infrastructure is critical and is one of the things that this committee and this Congress need to find a solution to. We've been stuck for the last 2 or 3 years in trying to resolve that issue, and we need to get past it. So there are areas where we can work together, but we should quit arguing about whether there's a crisis. We face an incredible crisis. We've got to make tough choices and take strong stands. Now, I just want to address one other thing quickly before my time runs out. A number of those who have spoken today already have talked about the fact that in addition to controlling our spending, there's a revenue side to the solution that's needed. I agree. I disagree that that solution is just to once again raise taxes. Those of us who've worked in the past on trying to address this issue have recognized that if you looked at our current tax code, you'd be hard-pressed to find one that's more unfair, more complex, more expensive to comply with, and frankly more anti-competitive to our own business interests and a dampener on capital formation in this nation. And what we need to do, which I believe this budget contemplates, though it's not the business of this budget, is that this budget contemplates a major effort to reform our tax code. I think we should flatten it. I think we should eliminate a lot of those provisions, the tax expenditures that have been described. I call them the deductions, credits, and exemptions in the code, the complexity of the code, and then reduce the rates and have a strong, powerful taxing engine in this country that will not just generate the revenue we need for our fiscal crisis, but will prompt and grow the kind of economic response in America that will generate jobs. I see my time is up, but Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for bringing forward a strong budget. I know there's going to be a robust debate over how we should address these issues, but to me, the most important thing that's happening today is that this committee is tackling this crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.